Good evening. Welcome to the Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Every week, EWTN gives me this opportunity to join with you for a time to talk with someone who, guided by the Holy Spirit, awakened to the fullness of the church through their love for Jesus Christ, and often unexpectedly. And each guest brings with them different histories, traditions, and that requires different barriers that different non-Catholics go through, depending on what theology you come with. I bring that up because our guest tonight is a former United Methodist, radically different than my own journey. And so we hear in different guests the different barriers as well as the different things that drew them to the fullness of the church. Our guest tonight is Timothy Putnam. And Timothy, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. Pull your way from your new duties, right, at your new church. What are you doing now?
I'm the Director of Marriage and Family Life for the Diocese of Tulsa. I've been there for about 2 years now.
Okay, all right. Well, very good. In fact, I think you, besides your regular website, you have a TimothyPutnam.com, right? And what would people find if they went to that?
Well, one of the things that I am privileged to do is to go and tell my story and to also talk about some of the issues that are very important to me, whether it be marriage enrichment or liturgical coherence, and specifically looking through from the Old Testament and the early church and then today, and looking what worship means to us and what the history is of that.
Yeah. One of the problems is I think that in the first days of the church, they must have had liturgy just fine, because the writers of the New Testament didn't talk about it very often.
Right.
They didn't have to correct anything in their letters. So rather than assuming they didn't have any liturgy,
right,
we recognize there was a deposit of faith that had been passed on that they were practicing. Well,
and in a lot of ways, in Hebrews 8:5, we see that the writer says that the temple, the Mosaic tabernacle, served as a shadow of heavenly worship. And so it shows us that we can assume that there was some connection between what was and then what became. So.
All right, well, good. We might get into that later. What I need to do is get out of the way as soon as possible and give you the opportunity to start from the beginning and give us a little bit of your spiritual journey.
Okay. Well, I started out very Methodist. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first licensed exhorter for the state of Louisiana, which was a lay pastor in the Methodist Church at that time. Both of his sons, who were both greats as well, were both circuit riders for the Methodist Church. My grandfather is a Methodist pastor. My father is an oxymoron. He's a United Methodist evangelist. And then 3 of my uncles were also Methodist pastors. And so I came into this heritage and this inertia in my family of Methodism. My mom and dad met at a Methodist school in Louisiana. Both of her parents were Methodist and had been for some time. And so there was there was no questioning that, of course, we're going to be Methodist. My father's a Methodist clergy and is on the road about 200 days a year still, going into different churches and preaching Christ in those places. Right.
Now, would he have had more than one church under his wing when he was a pastor?
Well, when he was a pastor, he pastored just at one church at a time. But when I was about 5 years old, he started into itinerant evangelism. And so he actually travels, he's in a different church each week at the invitation of that church. It's like parish missions would be considered.
I've often heard this. I wasn't sure that it was true, but I've often seemed like the goal of the Methodist Church was to have a church in every zip code of the United States.
Or 2 or 3.
Or 3. The point is that you'll have very small little Methodist churches that are often pastored by one pastor, might have 3, 4, or 5.
Right.
That he has the responsibility for. Now, you talk about that first ancestor. That takes you back almost to the time of Wesley's traveling around.
Not quite that far, but yeah, very early on.
Okay.
Very early on down in South Louisiana. So.
All right. Well, very good. So, it might be good. So you're talking about being brought up in a Wesleyan Methodist culture.
Mm-hmm. Very much.
Which, as a young boy then, might be a bit different than a lot of what our viewers understand. Maybe can you explain a little bit? I mean, when you're so much a part of a culture, sometimes it's hard to step out and describe it. But.
You know, for me, most of my culture was defined by the fact that my father was clergy, and since we traveled so much, even early on in life, we would be in different churches, but the pastor was always the same. I would hear my father preach, and so a lot of my theology came straight from him and not from Sunday school or any other place. And so I was when we weren't traveling, we attended a non-traditional Methodist church that tended towards maybe the charismatic expressions. And so that was my understanding. And my understanding was, we're Methodist, but we're this slightly different kind of Methodist. And so because of my father's position, this was probably the very beginning of my journey towards something other than Methodism, was because the Methodist Church is a semi-episcopacy, the bishop would appoint a pastor to a church, and they do that every year. So you may be at a church for 15 years, but you only are guaranteed that next year. They appoint you each year. But my father was somewhat outside of that appointment system. He was appointed to be an evangelist. And so he was able to say things about morality that, or other senses of justice that other pastors would feel a little bit hesitant to say, because if they said the wrong thing and made the bishop angry, he might send them to this tiny little church off in the middle of nowhere. And so I would hear every bad thing that ever happened in the Methodist Church, because they would call my dad and he would work something out and say something or act on that at an annual conference or a general conference level, so that I was aware of all of the flaws and not necessarily of the goodness anywhere outside of the theology we had at home. I was aware that, oh, well, this church over there denied the resurrection, or this church over here did something else. And so it created in me this distaste for the hierarchy of the Methodist Church.
Interesting.
Even though I very much loved the theology that I was raised with, and the expressions of devotion, of being in Scripture daily and in prayer daily as a family.
If you were to, since I'm assuming we have a mixed audience, many of whom may not be familiar with uniquely Methodist theology, what would you say is maybe the one that jumps out at you as a key, unique aspect of Methodism?
Methodism is this really interesting mix of holiness, of striving to be better and to basically to become saints. But also there's this affective side of Methodism as well. When it first started out, it was a great influence on music and on the music teaching the theology. So you have all these great Wesleyan hymns that we still find in Catholic hymnals today. Charles Wesley wrote over 5,000 hymns during his time of writing. And so he transmitted theology through that. Has some great hymns on the Lord's Supper that are practically Eucharistic in their nature. And so there's this devotion that's working out holiness, working out your salvation with fear and trembling. There's also this emotional aspect to it. But there's also a very intellectual side to Methodism, where it's about being sure and being thorough and thinking things through.
You don't find too many once saved, always saved Methodists.
Oh no, you wouldn't. Well, you wouldn't find any. As my father says, my father believes in the security of the believer as long as they're believers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I put it that way because that's kind of the opposite for people not familiar with evangelicalism. That there's two deeply committed evangelical Christians.
Right.
One a Calvinist, one a Wesleyan, could be at war with each other, just understanding how to be obedient to Jesus Christ.
Right. Yeah. And often are actually at war with one another. So that was my first experience, and didn't think anything else about that. I mean, from the third grade, I knew that I wanted to be involved in ministry.
Had it led? Now you're a PK.
I am a PK.
I got to challenge you. You know what they say in the courtroom. You know, you treat this as a what's that word for an angry juror. No, not what's the word I'm looking for, but
hostile witness.
Hostile witness, right? Yeah, you're a PK, you know. So, but the point is, in that process, had you come to a personal, intimate prayer life and commitment to Christ?
You know, I think with every relationship, it's one that develops over time.
Yeah.
So early on, I didn't understand the fullness of it. Probably about you go to summer camp and you have those great experiences, and I knew that God was calling me. I knew that I was to be involved in some sort of ministry, and at the time I had a very strong draw towards missions, and knew that seminary was in my path. And it probably was about my teenage years when I began to understand the meaning of grace, that God was not only calling me, but He was reaching out for me and accepting me fully as who I was.
Yeah.
And was able to just be vulnerable and to rest in His graces. But I mean, part of Methodism is, early Methodism specifically, is that devotion, that holiness. And so even before I had that understanding of the relationship, there was the daily scripture reading, and we memorized quite a bit of scripture to impress the Baptists, I'm sure. But scripture memory was a part of our life growing up, and prayer was a daily thing with our family. First thing in the morning, we'd go into the living room and read the scriptures, and generally from the Psalms and the Proverbs, and then the New Testament as well. And so that was just ingrained, and out of that seed that was planted in those times, the relationship developed. And the seed always predates the plant.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, I do remember when I was in the non-denominational seminary that I went to, Evangelical Seminary, there were lots of PKs there whose father, grandfather, great-grandfather, uncles, and there were a few of them there. Then the privacy would sit there with a cup of coffee and say, you know, I don't want to be here, but I've got no choice. Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting Protestant phenomenon where you're in a long line of all that. I mean,
no, for me it was very much a desire, and not necessarily one that I could explain, but I wanted to be somehow in ministry, to connect deeper, and there was always this striving, because I knew there was something more, and I thought maybe if I just read more or prayed more or did the right devotional things or didn't sleep in and got 5 extra minutes, and that then I would experience that thing I was looking for. And so when I went to college was the first time that I really began looking outside of the Methodist Church.
Had there been any Catholic contact at all growing up? You're in this really Methodist bubble.
My mother's brother married into the Catholic Church, and my oldest cousin, who coming up will be very influential, and really starting about college is when I started to interact with him more. He is a Catholic priest. He's the judicial vicar in the Diocese of Shreveport. And so he was my go-to. Anytime I had a question, he was the one I would go to. I had a very protracted RCIA. It took about 10 years, and he was my director in that. So when I went to my junior and senior year, I went to a non-denominational, charismatic high school for the last 2 years of school, and it was exposed in that to new forms of worship and new forms of music that I was somewhat drawn to. And so when I went to college, that was my chance to explore a little bit. And my thought was that I was going to look into the Vineyard Movement, because I was searching for how the early church worshiped, and my thought was that would be vernacular, culturally vernacular, that it would be not just in English, but that it would be of the style of the day, that it would be in small groups, cell-oriented, home-oriented. And I saw some of that, which was also foundational in the early Methodist church with the societies and bands and class meetings. But I found that being replicated, I thought, in the Vineyard Movement. So I had a leaning that direction, but was also part of a program that had me as an intern in a local church, and ended up actually at a Presbyterian church for a couple of years. So it must have been predestined.
I was going to say the Vineyard Movement is really, Acts chapter 2, bringing it to the modern day, living it out, signs and wonders. That was the big part of that. So,
in theory, that's correct. It doesn't always play out that way in practice in the individual churches.
All right. And so then to go Presbyterian, again, you're going but the other side of the street, opposite theology and everything decently and in order.
Right.
That's the motto there.
So I was there for a program in school that was giving me a scholarship, and they said, "We'd like you to go here," and I said, "You betcha."
Of course.
So I was there for about 2 years, but every time I would go home, I would find my way to the Vineyard Church and connect with the people there and try and get involved in the small groups and really experience what it was, because I was still looking for that one thing deeper, that one more connection that was somehow restless in me. As Augustine says, our souls are restless until we find our rest in you.
Our guest tonight is Timothy Putnam. That is it seems to me, kind of an underlying Methodist assumption, this idea to be going deeper. It's not necessarily a Calvinist thing, but really it's a part of holiness. There's always something deeper. I know that in many of the publications of the Methodist Church, that's where you find spirituality. You don't find them so much in the Presbyterian Calvinist perspective. So, it sounds like this whole long line of formation for you, almost subliminally, put within you a desire for a deeper walk with Christ.
It's not something that's necessarily preached as much anymore, but Wesley had this belief of entire sanctification being something that you could achieve on earth. And so his sermon on Christian perfection, if you go and read that, it's almost condemning, because you realize you don't measure up to that. And so there is this drive to purify yourself more, to let go of the things of earth and somehow reach that entire sanctification that's promised. And so I think that was part of that draw. And so for the first 2 years, I worked at that as an intern at that Presbyterian church. And then my last 2 years of college, I connected with a small non-denominational church. They called themselves Genetic Code Vineyard. But they weren't officially Vineyard, but they might as well be. And I served there as their worship leader, their music director, for those last 2 years of school. And it was in that time that I was looking for something more connecting and really something more emotive, because that was the way that I knew that I had connected with God, was I felt that I had connected with God. And I find that that's the case in a lot of the non-denominational branch, is the way you know that God's presence was there is that you had some stir of the emotions and felt it.
That warm feeling.
That warm, the heart strangely warmed, right? And so in school, and I did some traveling abroad, there was just that desire to find that tighter connection, that entire sanctification. And in college was also the only time in my life that I was even remotely anti-Catholic, and it wasn't because it was instilled in me, and it wasn't in the same way that it was for others. It expressed itself. I had a friend that was dating a Catholic, and I said, "Oh, if you marry them, you're going to have to be a Catholic, right?" "No, I won't." "Oh no, that's how it works." And so I recently emailed her back and said, "I was wrong, and I became Catholic before you. So there you have it." But during that time in college is also when I began to visit with my cousin down in Shreveport, the priest. And he was constantly planting little seeds. I would say something and he would find a way to draw it to a doctrine, and I'd ask a question. "So what about prayer to the saints?" And he would give me his answer in about 5 minutes, and there would be this little click in my brain, and I'd say, "Well, if that's what it is, I really don't have a problem with that. I have no issue with that." The first memory that I have of even knowing anything about Catholicism other than my uncle and my cousins were Catholic is in Denver in 1993. We were there for a conference, completely unattached to World Youth Day, but simultaneously. And so we're driving down the road and we see a march going by, and they've got the streets coned off, and maybe it was a Eucharistic procession or something about to happen. And my mom pointed over and said, "Oh, the Pope is going to be here," and began just to speak mostly neutrally, but a little warmly about his pro-life stances. We were a very pro-life family. One of the ways that we differed from the Methodist hierarchy was that while we had the Wesleyan theology that a lot of the hierarchy had somewhat been straying from,
right.
We were instilled as a family with a very strong moral core. And that ultimately was something that, as we get further in the story, will lead to the conversion. That there was this very strong sense of morality and of right and of wrong and of justice for those who are weak or less fortunate. So, and so that was my first experience. And then as I met with my cousin, I asked him all the questions that popped into my head as they popped into my head. But I'm pretty sure that he planted some of those questions in me. When I finally did go to seminary, I got this postcard from him that said, "Congratulations on making it to seminary. Maybe one day we'll call you Father Tim." And, I closed the card and chuckled to myself and thought, oh, how sweet. He's still trying, right? But every time that I would visit, maybe only half a dozen times during that span of 4 years, he would just be very not pushing. He wasn't obviously actively trying to convert me, but he was just answering those questions about the Eucharist, about apostolic succession, about the communion of the saints and Mary, and all of those things, the co-mediatrix, and all of those questions that will likely come up to a Protestant. Mm-hmm. And just spending maybe 10 minutes was the longest answer he ever gave, but it was enough to say, okay, well, there is some rationality to this. It's not just blind superstition or some other faith or other God. And so went to seminary, and then had a couple of professors there that swung.
And you went to a fairly conservative.
Oh, yes. Well, I went to Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky. And it was full circle because I was actually born in Lexington when my father was at Asbury Seminary. And so it was kind of a coming home for me at that point, because it was back to the heritage that I'd been raised with. Mm-hmm. And still thinking I'm going to go to seminary. I had my plan all out. I go to college and I get my music degree. And then I get a religion minor to kind of help me towards seminary. That my school was too small to do that. And so I had to get a religion and philosophy minor because they didn't have enough religion classes. And that philosophy minor played into the Catholicism later as well. And then I was going to go to seminary and I would get my MDiv, and then I would go on into missions for a few years. And so I went to seminary and loaded for bear with this idea of going back to small groups and house churches and starting over and throwing out the old and really getting back to the core of the faith. And I had two professors there, Dr. Lester Ruth, who's now at Duke, and Dr. Dale Hale, who's still at Asbury. One speaking in teaching about worship, and the other teaching about discipleship and the foundations of discipleship, who really drew me back toward the pendulum started to swing back toward the early church and looking at the tradition of the church. And hey, since you're wanting to get back to the early church, they actually wrote, they didn't stop writing after the Bible. We still have these documents of the Didache and these other things. And so went back and started looking at those documents and realizing what a sacrament is, that God's bestowing grace through these elements. One in particular, and I think the thing that really solidified sacramental theology for me was the question of infant baptism or not. And Methodist baptizes infants, and it's not a big deal. Right. But I did have one person that I was working with in a church that was looking through scriptures in a very sola scriptura kind of way and pointing out what were his proofs of adult baptism. And so I had that in my head as well. And I'm sitting there in this worship class, and the professor says, the question of baptism, either as infants or as adults, really hinges on the question of who's doing the action. If it's about our obedience and our acceptance and our proclamation of faith, then it would make sense that there would be an adult baptism. But if God's the one doing the action, it doesn't really matter when it is, does it? And that just flipped a switch in my head, and I'm like, oh, there's actually action taking place, that God's doing action through the sacraments? Really? And so for me, that was a very big turning point. And then also, as I approached Eucharistic theology, this is where that philosophy background came in, because I'd studied Plato and the forms of something having properties being different than its essence, that a chair is a chair because of its form and not because of what it's made of. And when someone explained to me the theology, the doctrine, the dogma of transubstantiation, that the essence is transformed, back there to that philosophy minor, that just clicked and made sense, and that God is doing the action and giving himself to us. And it still took some time before I came to a full Catholic view of that, but I began to see that, no, God really was present in that act of communion.
I mean, to a certain extent, within the wide range of Wesleyan theology, you can hold most of those things to a certain extent, because you have a certain freedom at the local level to hold a lot of those views.
Well, and Wesley would have said that baptism and communion were ordinances, not sacraments, and that they were means of grace. Right. So that they provided grace to some extent. He just didn't go to the full question of what an essence is. Right. And that was one of the difficult things for me much later, is as I had this view of the Eucharist and had this view that God was coming to me through communion, and I believe that through extraordinary grace as he was. And then to go into the offices after church service and see the remainder of the bread thrown out in the trash, and my heart just sunk. And I started getting there before they did and taking it outside and scattering it on the ground, because I didn't know anything else to do, just to keep it from being thrown in the trash. Yeah. Because there was this thought that Christ, this is supposed to be Christ. Even Wesley, Charles Wesley wrote a beautiful hymn, "Oh, the grace of love divine, the unfathomable grace. Who can say how bread and wine God into us conveys, how the bread his flesh imparts, how the wine transmits his blood, fills the faithful people's hearts with all the life of God." So, I mean, it's not quite the full transubstantiation view, but it's very close. And so then to see it just discarded was very difficult.
Well, in many ways, the transubstantiation view of the church presumes a philosophical foundation.
Right.
Because you're using just what you've talked about, substances and accidents. Right. But if you come at it from a non-philosophical, you don't have that background, you don't know that, because if your formation wasn't there, then what Charles Wesley is saying in his hymn is about as close as you can get to expressing from his background what's going on here.
Well, I really see that philosophy minor as a grace of God preparing me for coming into the Catholic Church.
Why don't we pause there, Timothy? Okay. Our guest tonight is Timothy Putnam, and let's take a break. We'll come back because he's in seminary, right?
Yep.
And we're going to find out as he fights these battles and his mind is open to a more fullness understanding of the church. See you there. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host. Our guest tonight is Timothy Putnam, former United Methodist, and I've paused him right in the middle of the questions that you're encountering at seminary, which, as you said, were kind of planted and watered a little bit by your cousin, the priest, who's praying at all that time that one day you're going to be Father Putnam.
That was not going to happen. was looking forward to marriage a little too much.
Had you met your future wife at this point?
No,
Okay.
but I was always on the lookout.
All right. Okay. All right.
So we didn't interrupt seminary too much because it was a very brief stint for me. I was there for about just about 2 years,
Okay.
maybe a year and a half. Because the longer I was there and looking at the MDiv, the more I felt pressure to go into pastorate. And while I'd always been drawn to the ministry, pastorate was never something that I felt called to do or that I needed to do. It was either in an idea of parachurch or in missions or in music. And so as I felt that pressure, whether perceived or actual, I went ahead and withdrew from seminary and moved on. And so I did my level best to get away from the Methodist Church. I really did. But that's where my connections were. That's where my network was. That's where people, if I would say my name, they would know who I was. Oh, were you related to? Yes, he's my father. I still get that question all the time. And so the first thing I ended up doing out of seminary is I worked doing some graphic design for a Methodist missions organization, and did that for a couple of years. And just any time that you're in a situation where you have to raise your own support, as you know, it's a difficult proposition.
Right.
And so after a year, I began to look towards something else, and this was the first time I experienced unemployment, and I experienced that for 9 months. And God was teaching me. I didn't realize it at the time, but He was taking me through some Lectio Divina. Every time I'd say, "Okay, God, I need some encouragement. Where do you want me? Where should I read?" I would hear very clearly, probably the clearest I've ever heard God, Hebrews 5:8. I got sick of hearing Hebrews 5:8 because it says, "Although He was a son, He learned obedience through the things He suffered." I'm like, I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear about suffering. What do you mean? And that went on for about 6 months, that every time I'd ask, and every time I'd go to pick up the scripture, and I'm like, I'm going to turn somewhere else, I'm not even going to ask, I'd hear Hebrews 5:8. And so I meditated and contemplated by force, not even because I wanted to, what suffering leads to and what suffering means.
I don't want to distract from your flow, but within Methodism, is there this understanding of suffering as an important part of the spiritual journey? In your background?
There may be some in Methodism, but I was in those churches that also had that charismatic mix in, and in the charismatic world, suffering is something that God doesn't want. Even though I wasn't in a church that was what would be considered faith movement, there was still that seed of God wants to free us from infirmity and from suffering. And so that was what I was expecting, and not expecting this protracted length of unemployment. And I was always sustained, but not all the time, a lot more than that. Yeah. And so I finally decided, okay, well, I'm not having any luck looking for graphic design jobs because God didn't want me doing that anymore, I guess. So I'll go ahead and I'll look again for a music job, because that was my long-term plan anyway. And so through my father, through the network that he knew, he had just mentioned, some pastor had mentioned that they were looking for a worship pastor, and he said, well, my son's looking for that job. And so I interviewed and was given the position and moved out to Arkansas, where I took over the contemporary worship service and the children's choirs for Bryant First United Methodist Church in Arkansas. And the pastor was an excellent guy, theologically sound, had been there for 15 years. And so there was job security. This was great. And so I served there for a year and almost 2 years. And about a year and a half through, the pastor got the call that he was being moved. It's like, I just got here. So much for job security. And one of the things that I've experienced, it's not a universal experience, but one of the things that I've experienced is that when a new pastor comes in, the staff is not secure in the slightest. And so in the first 6 months of him being there, he had fired 7 of the 12 staff, and I was the first one to go. And so I think that time we were unemployed for about 3 months. And my my prayer, sometimes shaking the fist at God angrily, was, Psalms 37:4, or Proverbs 37:4. Never I've seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. And I don't know if I'm righteous, but I know my parents are. And so you're obligated, God. So we looked again for work and found a job helping a church plant, Free Methodist Church, which was a little bit different denomination, but still the same heritage. And that was up in Iowa, which is very cold because I'm from Texas. And so we moved up to Iowa, and that lasted a total of 5 months. New church plants are notoriously difficult.
Yeah, right.
I think only 1 out of 10 churches that's planted lasts 10 years. And so after 5 months, we were again looking. And I said, I'm done with the 3 and 5 month searches. I just can't wait that long. And so we moved back down to Dallas, where my family was from.
Now, when you say we, at this point, are you?
At this point, I'm married. Yes. I skipped her. I'm sorry. No, I met her when I was working at the missions organization before I moved to Bryant. She was a student at Oral Roberts University. And we went to the same college and career young adult group. And so she grew up charismatic, not really affiliated with any denomination. Her father was a military chaplain and just notoriously ecumenical in that regard. And they went to New Life Church in Colorado Springs. And so she went to a small, almost fundamentalist school, not quite as severe as that, but definitely some fundamentalist tendencies. And so she was the charismatic one, always swimming against the grain. And so she's like, I'm going to go to Oral Roberts, where people from my church came from, and then I'm going to finally fit in. And she went to Oral Roberts, and they were way more charismatic than she was used to. And so then she was swinging back towards Orthodoxy, and then I met her, and I had just gone to a conference at my cousin's church where Scott Hahn spoke on the Lamb's Supper.
Oops.
And so I mentioned to her, because she was talking about worship theology, and that's kind of my soapbox. So I started talking about this Lamb's Supper and this idea of the Mass found in the book of Revelation, and she was fascinated by that. And so every time that she'd finish hearing some heretical chapel speaker, she would come and say, now, this is what they said, and I know that's not right. And so I'd say, well, no, of course it's not right, because you've got this scripture here and this one over here. And so she began that journey probably about 4 or 5 years into my journey as we were walking together in that way. And then she was in Arkansas with me, and then again in Iowa. So here we are in Iowa. We're moving back to Dallas. And my theory was, I'm going to go back, I'm going to get just a normal job. I first thought I was going to do alternative certification to teach, and passed the test with no problem. But the jobs just weren't there. And so I went to this headhunter, creative headhunter, and showed them my resume and my portfolio, and they said, well, we think we'll have a place for you on Wednesday. And I went back to my house and really got down on my face and on my hands and my knees and said, God, I don't know, I've got this secular appointment of they're going to place me wherever they're going to place me. I could be anywhere. And I don't know if you can do it, which is a dangerous thing to say to God. I don't know if you can do it, but one thing I ask, and that I would seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And that's been the cry of my heart even before I knew it, to be in some way connected with ministry. And so I get a call the next morning saying, okay, well, we've got a place for you, and on Wednesday we'd like you to show up to Prestonwood Baptist Church to be their senior graphic designer. I'm like, how did this happen? Thank you, God. And I was there on contract for 6 months, working for Aquiant, but at Prestonwood, until they could no longer afford to do that contract basis, and they couldn't really afford to hire me because they would have to pay the the fee to the headhunter as well. And so then I'm looking again and saying, God, one thing I ask, that I would seek. And so I ended up at Daystar Television, which is a Protestant, non-denominational EWTN. EWTN's much better. So I worked for them as a graphic designer doing print ads for about 6 months, but just really felt God drawing me back. Now, at that time that I was doing that work, I was also attending a very large 15,000 member church called Gateway. There in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. I had some friends who were on the worship staff there, and I figured if I could figure out how they administrated a worship team of 200 people, then I could scale it down and fit it in anywhere. But around Easter, I really missed liturgy. I really missed some sense of liturgy. And so I saw this person in clerics in a coffee shop, and I bought him a coffee and talked a little bit to him and found out he was Episcopalian, but Anglican, the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And lo and behold, their parish was a block and a half from where I'd been going to Gateway. And so we would go to the early service at Gateway, and then we would leave and we'd drive a block and a half and go to the late service at St. Lawrence Anglican Church, and experience this beautiful
Gateway
liturgy.
Is just contemporary, modern guitars, the whole 9 yards of a real
production, lights and big drums,
all of that.
Right.
To high church liturgy, organ, choir.
Every week.
Yeah.
And at the time, I felt that I couldn't find the fullness of what I was looking for at either one, so we'd just go to both. And I had some people there just saying, well, why don't you just quit going over there, because that's vapid and there's nothing there. Why don't you come over here and just only come here? And I wasn't ready quite to do that. But as I was there, I was feeling the draw back to being in ministry and not just behind a computer and a desk. And so I put the resume out again and was looking just in Texas because I wanted to be near my family. And I just couldn't find anything. So one day I took off. I had the realization that, good gracious, in Texas I could practically be in Ohio and still be, if they send me down to South Texas, I'd still be closer in Ohio. So we took off the Texas indicator, and lo and behold, Tulsa, Oklahoma, there it was, first one. And I sent my resume, and I'm used to these 3 to 5 month search processes. So I send in my resume. I get a call at 10 o'clock the next morning saying, so you sent your resume in. Are you really serious about this? Because we don't want to pursue it if you're not really serious. I'm as serious as I know how to be at the moment. And that process, from that point until I was there visiting, was 2 weeks. And from the point I visited to the point I moved there was another 2 weeks. It was lightning fast. And so here I was, and I was not only contemporary, but I was everything, Minister of Worship and Arts. So I had 3 services that were all stylistically distinct. I had liturgy, traditional, a very small service in the chapel. I had the contemporary service, and then I had the liturgical service at 11 o'clock in the main sanctuary. And I had the children's choir and the adult choir, and I oversaw the handbells. We had another director for that, and just the whole kit and caboodle. And we had probably about 1,500 members there at that church. And somewhere in that time, I read this book, and I can't even remember who it's by some Protestant who was talking about Benedictine spirituality and visiting and doing retreats at monasteries. And I'd had some friends that had gone in seminary to the Abbey of Gethsemane. Yeah. And I thought, well, I wonder if we have any abbeys or something, monasteries around here. And lo and behold, the Diocese of Tulsa has the Clear Creek Monastery, which is all extraordinary form. And so I thought, well, I'll take I called a friend.
All Latin Mass, that's extraordinary form, right?
Yeah, all Latin Mass. So I had a friend that was in Catholic seminary at the time, and he pointed me to who I needed to talk to do a retreat. And I called in and went out and did one retreat there. And then the next year I'm thinking, well, I need another retreat, but I want to try something different. So my cousin, again, from from Louisiana was going up to Subiaco in Arkansas, and I'll just meet him at Subiaco. And so we had a retreat together there, experiencing that spirituality as well. And during the same time, I'm noticing, much to my surprise, because I'd always my history was the contemporary worship, the full bands and drums and electric guitars and all that, and so I'm finding as I walk through the halls of my church that I'm working at, that it's not the new song that I just heard on the CD that I'm humming down the hallways. It's the hymns that I grew up with and that I'm leading each week. And they were the ones that were sticking in my soul and feeding me during the week. And that just shocked me. And so during this time, I was ready again to look at seminary. I was hoping to find my way into official recognition, basically. I was working on a staff at a church. Everyone that was at the church saw me as being pastoral, but I didn't have the ordination. Yeah. I didn't have the connection, the authority, as it were. And I was always struggling between this balance of freedom and authority, and wondering how they fit together. You know, that whole Vineyard Movement time, right. And yet there was something missing there, and that was the some sense of authority. And so, during this time, pardon me. Sorry. So I was looking for going back to seminary to do the diaconate, because the diaconate, if you're a deacon instead of an elder in the Methodist Church, you pick where you go. If you're an elder, the bishop tells you where you're going to serve, and I didn't want to be moved, and I didn't want the potential of being set as a senior pastor, and so I'm like, deacon, that's the safe track. So the local seminary that was recognized by the Methodist Church was Disciples of Christ. And it's about as far as you can get away from the theology I was raised with. And everything that I held dear about my faith was questioned and attacked within the first 30 minutes of orientation. And there was just this knot growing in my heart, thinking, you know, is it worth this? Can I really put up with this? Can I do this? And eventually I decided within about the first 2 hours that no, nothing's worth this. Any master's degree will get me. I'll go get a music master's. I'm not going to suffer through who knows how long of this kind of vicious theology. And so in order for me to go to seminary, before we had gotten to this orientation, we were looking for any kind of extra income. And we'd practiced NFP throughout the course of our marriage because of some friends of ours that converted in seminary. They introduced us to it. And our initial NFP teacher, back before we were married, said, well, you're going to be a great convert one day. And I said, no, I'm not.
Because at this time still, you and your wife are just, that's not even
this
on
was
the screen.
This was back, over 7 years ago now. And even close to the end, I wasn't sure that I'd ever actually convert. You know, I'd say, well, I'm not a Protestant because I'm not protesting anything, but I'm comfortable where I was. I had a home, so I thought. And so Kristen, in order for me to go back to seminary, we sent her to learn to teach NFP. And she came back from that training and said, I'm ready to convert. I thought you were following. She'd always said, well, I'll convert if you convert because I don't want to split our family. But she'd never been the really excited, passionate one. And she came back and said, I'd never met any cradle Catholics who were passionate. I'd met a lot of converts at the time. And she said, I went to this training and they're all cradle and they're all just on fire for their faith. And so she came back ready. And I said, well, you have to wait a little while. And she started reading the science behind contraception and started becoming, as pro-life, becoming more and more convinced that she couldn't do that. And how not only had we not done it, but nobody else should do it either. And so I started reading. She brought home with her Christopher West book, The Good News About Sex and Marriage. And I read through that and began to read the theology of the body, and that was the changing point for me. That was the point at which I realized not only was the Catholic Church right about so many things, but where I was, I couldn't stay anymore. There were a lot of things going on that, as the worship pastor, there's this sense of, if you don't play the right song, God wasn't here today. And so there was a lot of animosity driven because I wasn't the right jukebox. I wasn't playing the thing that they wanted me to play. And I was getting very tired of that. And then at the same time, I'm seeing, with the strong sense of morality instilled in me by my parents, that here is something that the Catholic Church teaches and has always taught that is right, and nobody else is teaching it. So, as I look at transubstantiation and real presence, well, I could find some semblance of real presence in the Methodist Church. I was allowed to be theological. I was allowed to be sacramental to some extent in the Methodist Church. But here on this point of morality, no one else was teaching it. So for me, it was a sense of, there is no one else. This is a key point, and no one is teaching this. It was that last little hinge point. And so I went to another retreat, and I was sure that it was time to be Catholic. And I was just looking for the opportunity. So we began putting the resume out and looking for any job that we could do that would allow us to not have our sole dependency on being in the ministry at a Protestant church. And it took a while. We started going to Vigil Mass. So for 8 months, we would go to Vigil Mass at Church of the Madeleine, and then wake up the next morning and lead 3 services at the Methodist Church. And I remember the night, there was a tornado warning, so we were in this closet underneath the stairs that we call Narnia, because you have to push through the coats to get to it. And there was a tornado warning, and I got this email for a meeting that I knew meant that there was some people were unhappy with the music, and I was going to need to make some changes. And I worked through all the thoughts in my head of, okay, I can pretend that that I'm going to make those changes and keep my job a little bit longer, knowing full well that I don't intend to stay. Or I can just leave now. We'd had a great interview with a specific job, and there had been a verbalization that we interpreted as a potential verbal offer, but nothing was set or firm. And so we just prayed, okay, God, what do we do? Here are our options. And I heard God very clearly say to me, do you trust me? Well, God, you know I trust you. I trust you with my whole life. But it'd be really great if you would provide this job. Yes, but do you trust me? And I leaned over to my wife and I said, this is what I'm hearing. She said, let's do it. And so 3 weeks after Easter, well, the Tuesday after Easter, we gave our 3-week notice. And
had you come in at that Easter?
No.
No, okay.
No.
Okay. You're not in, yeah.
She had gone through, during that course of that 8 months in secret, she had gone through a personal, private RCIA. And through just a couple of conversations with Father, he just determined that I would be okay. And so we gave our 3-week notice. May 19th was my last day at the Methodist Church. May 20th was our 5th anniversary, and May 21st on Vigil Mass, we came into the Catholic Church and have just found, through the graces of the sacrament, what was missing when we were going to both the high liturgy. We loved the liturgy, but we were missing that contemporary worship because we were missing that connection with God. And through the Eucharist, though it's not as highly emotional, we found that connection that sustains us to the point that when we go back to visit family and we've gone to that Gateway Church again, we feel like we don't really need this. We need the Eucharist. So.
Well, it's also neat to see how the thing that the Lord used to open your hearts is also what the Lord's given you now,
right,
is the opportunity to serve Him in the church,
mm-hmm,
and that's defending family, defending life.
Right. And we also do a lot of talks. we've been in several parishes around the country talking about the theology and the morality and the medical side of contraception, and then also the science behind natural family planning, and have just the great pleasure to do that as well.
You have a website, www.nfpaware.com, where folk can go to find out more what you're doing. Timothy, thank you very much. Time flies.
It does.
It's wonderful you to share your journey with us, and I'm praying that your witness is an encouragement to others dealing with some of the same issues. So thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. God bless you. See you next week.